Hi, this is Andres Barron from Art 305, and this is my student art critic video analysis. And today I'm going to be talking about two paintings from the Huntington Library, and my artists are Mary Cassatt and Mark Gertler. So just to start off with Mary Cassatt, just as her background. Her full name is Mary Stevenson Cassatt. She was born May 22nd, 1844 in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, into a large and wealthy family. She was one of 7 children, 2 of which died in infancy. Her father spent time as a stockbroker and a land speculator, and her mother came from a wealthy family who worked in banks. She was artistically inclined and started her early school life at age 6, and she was brought into a culture that emphasized traveling, which is why she moved from country to country and also learned French and German along the way. She attended the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts at age 15, despite the lack of support from her family in pursuing a career in art. There was obviously objection to this because during this time everybody was openly sexist, and there were lots of doors that haven't been broken down up to this point, and she was one of the few that, and in her field, she ended up making a difference. So yes, she attended the university, and she ended up leaving it because of the patronizing of male teachers and students. And at one point, she even decided to take it upon herself to teach herself because it was more useful that way than trying to put up with them. And in 1866, despite her father's opposition, she moved to France with her mother and family friends. And women at the time could not attend the École des Beaux-Arts, so she went around this barrier by privately studying with professors and masters of the school instead. Over the years, she studied under names such as Charles Chaplin and Thomas Couture. And during this time, she also painted a Mandolin Prayer, which remains only one of 2 of her documented paintings submitted to and accepted by the Paris Salon within the first 10 years of her career. And that will be a problem that you're going to hear about soon. She returned to America in 1870, living with her family again, and her father, still opposing this, her becoming an artist. He accepted her, but only paid for her basic needs, but none of her art supplies. And in a letter, she described being frustrated with the lack of success she had, and she had a desire to go back to Europe to be fully employed and live there. She also noted how she hadn't touched a paintbrush in over 6 weeks and considered to no longer paint until she goes back to Europe. So she went to Chicago, and she tried to make paintings and money over there, but most of her work was lost due to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Soon after, though, she had a gig with the Archbishop of Pittsburgh, who had her paint 2 copies of paintings done by Correggio in Parma, Italy, and this funded her enough money to go back to Europe and pay off some of the living expenses for the next few months. She returned to Europe again, living in Prima, and one of her paintings, she gained prominence from her painting 2 women throwing flowers during Carnival. And she also traveled to Madrid and Seville making paintings, and finally took up residence in Paris in 1874, which is where she primarily lived for her lifetime. She spoke out against the Salon after she recognized that most of her works and other women's works were not being recognized unless they knew somebody who was on the jury to approve them. As a result of this, she left the group and went with the Impressionists, who they carried no manifesto, and their techniques and standards varied. You could say that what they practiced was very, very laissez-faire, and it was up to the artists themselves. They were under scrutiny from other critics, and she was no different, as some of the criticism that was coming to her paintings was that the colors were too bright and that her portraits were too accurate to be flattering to the subjects. And here are some of her paintings. And after 1886, she moved away from Impressionism to being a nomad with her techniques. She spent a lot of time experimenting and not really sticking with one particular method. And up until 1810, she was very active with her work, and she took a trip to Egypt around this time, and she was very inspired after the trip. Yet she had a crisis regarding her views and her physical state as well. She had diabetes, cataracts, and several other serious health complications. And by 1914, she was nearly blind and had stopped new works completely. And she silently passed June 14th, 1926. And as of 2005, her paintings, out of all of them, they have sold for a peak of nearly $2.9 million. So, if there's anything you've noticed from her paintings, a common theme is she likes to paint women and children. She likes to capture the intimate moments or daily occurrences that happen between mother and daughter in most of her work. Her main color palette consisted of using bright colors, as she was once criticized for. She not often did she use the color black, which with the Impressionists they called it a forbidden color, and she created images that pop out to the viewer. So in some of these you can see a common theme. Like I said, all of these are mother and daughter and just their children, and they capture the intimate moments that happen every day in life. So in the top left we can see perhaps the child is telling the mother something, telling her a story. In the middle one we can see that perhaps it's the same thing again, or maybe the mother's talking to them. And in the top right we see the daughter maybe reading something off the paper to her mother, or asking her to read it for her, being taught. And now it's my painting that I want to highlight and go in depth about, which is Breakfast in Bed. It was made in 1897, and it's at the Huntington Library. So obviously this follows the common theme again of women and children, or mother and daughter, I should say, and these intimate moments that are captured and happen every day, or at least they're somewhat daily occurrences. So again, we see that her main color palette consisted of using semi-bright colors. In this one, not so much, because the primary colors here are white, a teal, and she also likes to play with the shadows. We don't see much black except for the top of the bedside table, and maybe even the eyes and the color, certain shades in the hair. So she likes to also, just like many other artists, she likes to play with the shading of the room. So we can see in the top left behind the pillow, we can see a little bit of shade, a little bit of a darker shade on the mother's hair. We can see it on the pillows with the gray and the bed sheets. Underneath the plate, we could see a darker shadow that looks like it's completely blacked out, and even the middle gap in the bottom right between the bed and the table. So in this painting, there is a common theme that I do see, which is outside of the important subjects that give us context as to what is happening. So the mother, the daughter, and the plate and the cup. There is a lot of four-sided shapes, such as squares and rectangles. So we can see it at the bed just below the child. We can see where her feet kind of cut it off. It makes somewhat of a rectangular shape. On the bedside table, we see another square. With the pillow, we see an obvious square, the one that she's laying on. And on the board for the bed, where the pillow and herself are lying, we see another rectangular shape, but it stretches across the entire frame. And in my opinion, this is important because since we're obviously looking at a painting of a mother and daughter, they aren't going to follow the shape of a square, because our body is just a different shape from that, and they hold different traits. So in my opinion, it does bring more attention to the mother and the daughter, and even the cup and the plate, like I said, because they don't also follow that square/rectangle trend. It makes you analyze what is going on. So, and the faces of our subjects are important. So we can see here that the daughter, she's holding something in her hand. It is more than likely food, and she's looking either off into the distance or at the plate and the cup. and maybe she wants to go get some more because it looks like she's trying to leave. And on the mother, we can see that she looks very tired and not lazy, but just lounging around. And we see her trying to hold the child. And the cup and the plate, it indicates to us, since it's on the bedside table and the cup is stacked on top of the plate, that they probably just finished eating and drinking whatever they were drinking. And if this was made in modern times, I feel like a new title for this photo could be 5 more minutes. And the reason I say this is because it looks like it looks as if she's saying 5 more minutes, come back to bed. And we obviously have this. You hear about this nowadays because of people's alarms, like, oh, just 5 more minutes, trying to get a little bit extra more sleep. This is what this painting looks like. It's the equivalent then of 5 more minutes. And now my next one is Mark Gertler. He lived a very rough and depressing life. He was born into a poor Jewish family in Spitalfields, London, the 9th of December, 1891. They were immigrants, and they had a total of 5 children, which he was the youngest. After a failed attempt by his father when he was very young to attain some wealth and move to America, they ended up in London, England in 1896. And he displayed his artistic talents from a young age, and in 1906, he left school to attend the art classes at Regent Street Polytechnic. He attended for a year, but due to his family's financial situation, he could only attend evening classes and had to spend most of his time working to help support the family. But in 1908, his art career really took a push when he placed 3rd in a competition, and he applied for a scholarship which he received and accepted, and he used that money to attend the Slade School of Art, University College in London in 1908. He stuck there for 4 years, studying under other artists such as Paul Nash, C.R.W. Nevinson, among others. And while there, he met a woman named Dorrie Carrington. She was also a painter as well, and he fell deeply in love with her, and you could say he was obsessed with her, or he just had a very strong infatuation, and this was never reciprocated by her. And he relentlessly pursued her for many years. She lived for a majority of her life with Leighton Strachey, who was a man, and she was in love with him despite him being gay. So he was very stuck. He was obviously very depressed about this, and this obviously made him frustrated and jealous of him. And he wrote of this in many letters. These written accounts are talked about in a book called Mark Gertler, written by Sarah McGougal, and it's also the plot of a movie called Carrington, which was released in 1995. She later married Ralph Partridge, and this ended their relationship, whatever was left of it. And he threatened to commit suicide after learning of this, and this isn't the only time that he did this. He ended up having a relationship with Walter Sickert that led to his success painting society portraits. And he would find conflict because he wanted to act upon his own vision and do things his way, which led to him living in poverty. And as a result of this, it all led back to not having enough buyers or eyes and attention on his art. And on the right, you could see arguably his most famous painting, which is the Merry-Go-Round, which was painted in the middle of World War I. As you can see, using two of his paintings as examples, you can see that it is very, while they're almost cartoonish the way he makes his paintings. They look very realistic. You can see humans, you can see a real life situation, but the shapes that he uses are so rounded and they don't have as much detail, which makes it look almost like a dark cartoon. Soon later, he met Gilbert Cannon, and he lived with him for short periods of time, on and off, and they remained close friends. He made a painting of Gilbert that is up for viewing at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And Gilbert was a writer, so they shared inspiration from each other, and Mark made this painting called Gilbert Canaan at his mill, and this obviously shares another common theme with the merry-go-round and many of his other paintings, which is that they're based in real settings, real situations, but they look very cartoonish because of the shapes and way things are drawn. And they also look very dark, even though obviously this one on the left, it takes place in the day, but because of his use of shading, you can see it in the windmill, the windmill house. You can see it in the dogs in the shape of Gilbert, the trees. Everything is shaded, which makes the painting look a lot darker, even though it is set in a bright place. And since Gilbert was a writer, he used Mark's early life experiences and his stories and based it on a character for his 1916 novel Mendel. And he even included his infatuation with Dora Carrington as a detail. In 1920, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and as a result of this and other health complications, his dark view of the world obviously darkened even more because of this. He had to go to sanitariums multiple times as a result of this. And he also had two of his close friends died of tuberculosis, continuing his string of bad luck. In 1930, by the end of the decade and the start of the new, he married Marjorie Greatorex Hodgkinson, and they had a child in 1932, Luke Gertler, and they both suffered with illnesses themselves and sickness, and even when they were around each other, they did have a rocky relationship. During this time, to also help supplement and aid with his paintings, he took up a part-time teaching role at the Westminster School of Art. And before 1936, he was reported to have attempted suicide once already. And in 1939, he finally committed suicide as he gassed himself in his studio in London. And the reason for this is presumed to be his financial struggles, his broken marriage, and grieving over the death of those close to him. And now for my painting, it's called Girl in a Blue Jersey, 1912, just about 20 years before he died. So a little young. When he was in his 20s, it was in the earlier stages of his career. And the reason I chose this and why it kind of fascinated me is because there's an old commercial called Berries and Cream. I'm going to leave a link so you can watch it. And this painting of the girl in the subject, she has the same haircut and has a similar look to the actor that is in the commercial. And I just found that very funny. But if we do analyze this, knowing what we know about Mark Gertler, it's a little bit different, especially compared to the other two, the merry-go-round and the picture of Gilbert Canaan, because it's just one. It's the one girl as the main subject. There are no particular, I guess you could say, shapes or trends with it that he used. It's just a close-up shot of a woman. But the thing is this seems a lot significantly more detailed than his other two when you compare them. So if we go back, we can see, obviously, I've said before, like, he has a trend of painting very realistic things. So these are self-portraits he's done of himself, but they look almost cartoonish because of the shading, and you could say even the lack of intense detail. That would be a better way to describe it. And yes, they just look a little bit cartoonish. Perhaps it's because of the shading. You could even say the shapes that he uses. They still look realistic, but not realistic enough. And obviously we can say that with these, they share very similar themes with the self-portraits. And this is also why it stood out to me, is because compared to his other ones, this one really stands out because it seems like it has more detail, and it is very realistic. It looks like as if somebody is staring right at you, but it still has a cartoonish look to it, which is why it stands out to me. Yes. So that is why this one is very significant, is because since it was at an earlier time of his life, this is presumably before things took a very dark turn, whether it be his infatuation, the death of those close to him, his health complications, his since he was at the start of his career, he was probably more hopeful of his career because he did not attain that he never attained a considerable amount of success in the time that he was alive, as he was obviously financially struggling, which it does show a very stark contrast in the difference between his early career versus the later stages of his career. And he was very young when he was considerably young when he committed suicide. He was in his 40s. So just to see the difference between paintings and, I guess you could say, his outlook on life at the time is significant in this photo.